Welcome back to SOAP Notes 101. In our last slide, we finished the objective section of writing a SOAP note, and we will start this section of the lecture out by addressing assessment and plan, and then moving on to some examples of SOAP notes. So in your assessment section, you are documenting what you think is going on with the patient. You would arrive at this conclusion based on the synthesis of subjective and objective evidence to arrive at a diagnosis. The assessment also describes the patient's status and your analysis of the problem and possible interaction of different medical problems. Your diagnosis can be either a straightforward diagnosis when you are able to ascertain a specific problem based on the clinical information that you have collected today. It can be in the form of a list of differential diagnoses. This is a list of the different possible diagnoses. It's typically documented from most to least likely, and the thought process behind this list, or the rationales, are also documented. This is where the decision-making process is explained in depth. Included should be the possibility of other diagnoses, but are less likely. And typically you would document your differentials in terms of the top of the list being the most likely and on down to the least likely. For a patient that has multiple diagnoses, multiple comorbidities, or current and chronic medical diagnoses that are ongoing, you can document the list of diagnoses in terms of a problem list. Again, you'll want to list the items on the problem list should be listed in terms of order of importance. And each problem is also known as a diagnosis. So when you use differential diagnosis, you will need to gather more information to determine the final diagnosis. So a list of differential diagnoses is a list of possible diagnoses in order of most to least level of suspicion for each diagnosis. Follow-up regarding a decision once the information has been obtained to create a diagnosis should be documented in your plan. And if you're sure of your diagnosis, there's really no need to write out a list of differentials, unless, of course, that is your assignment. And presumptive treatment may change in light of new information, usually getting back test results. And when you're writing your plan, you do need to detail any anticipated follow-up that you'll have with the patient. So on that note, the section that includes the plan, it's either the treatment or the need for additional testing and consultation with other clinicians. It also addresses any additional steps that are going to be taken to treat the patient. And this section is important to help future providers understand what needs to be done next when the patient presents for follow-up. So for each problem, you'll want to state which test is needed and the rationale for choosing each test or additional study to resolve your diagnostic ambiguities. Ideally, you'll also document what your next step would be given the results of the test that you order. You'll also detail any therapies needed, including medications, surgery, or other treatment, any referrals to additional specialists, and any patient counseling or education that you go over with the patient. Be sure to clarify any questions with the patient regarding their treatment, referrals, or education, and then document that the patient verbalizes understanding and agrees to the plan. Obviously, if the patient does not agree to the plan, then you should document your discussion as well. So a couple of key things when you're writing SOAP notes. Be sure that your SOAP note is comprehensive. Your documentation has to take into account all of the subjective and objective information and accurately assess it to create a patient-specific assessment, and plan. And remember, in the case of legal liability, your proper and thorough documentation is your only defense. If you didn't document it, you didn't do it. Finally, your colleagues will appreciate a thorough note with documented rationales, and they will respect your clinical decision-making and ability more when your documentation is well written, easy to follow, and complete. So I'll go through a couple of examples. This first SOAP note is a very basic, straightforward problem, but a thorough and well-written SOAP note. So in this case, you have a 19-year-old female who's presenting to urgent care, and she's reporting burning with urination for the past 2 days. It goes on to include some detail about her HPI, including the onset of symptoms, what she was doing at that time, some alleviating factors, things that she tried to help herself feel better, and then a very targeted review of systems in the form of asking the patient about hematuria, fever, and flank pain, and finally a very brief assessment of the patient's medical and sexual history, which are pertinent to this particular problem. In your objective, vital signs are included, with the most important of those in this case being the temperature. So this patient is afebrile. An in-office clean catch urinalysis was done, which revealed small blood, large leukocytes, positive nitrites, and the targeted physical exam focused on CVA tenderness and suprapubic tenderness. Based on the clinical data and history, this patient was diagnosed with, presumptively, with an uncomplicated UTI. So in the plan, the patient was treated with antibiotics, and also a urine culture and sensitivity was sent. And there's a documented plan to follow up with the patient by phone if the culture results show that she needs to be switched to a different antibiotic. One thing that I'm seeing that's missing from this is documentation that the patient was asked about allergies, which is always an important step to take whenever you're prescribing any medication. As far as the patient education is concerned, it's well documented with the need for hydration, frequent urination, hygiene, and finishing all of the antibiotics as directed. Finally, if the symptoms persist or get worse and the warning signs for pyelonephritis are reviewed with the patient, and the patient verbalizes understanding and agrees to the plan. So this is a very thorough, basic SOAP note for a straightforward problem. This is the type of documentation that you will be doing in your Typhon logs when you're seeing a patient for just a straightforward problem-based encounter. The second example is a similar problem, but this is really in a case study SOAP format. This is not the type of documentation that you would be doing in the real world for this particular type of problem. This is more of a case study format. So, but some of the elements are the same, including under your subjective, you have your chief complaint, an HPI, allergies are documented. Here is a targeted medical, family, and social history along with health maintenance for this patient. There's a complete review of systems documented here and a complete physical exam. Again, it's unlikely that unless this patient is coming in for an annual physical and just happens to mention dysuria, it's very unlikely that you would do this level of physical exam in a patient with a straightforward complaint of dysuria. So here we have our assessment, dysuria, and a presumptive diagnosis of a UTI and the rationale. This student included an exhaustive list of differentials, which really goes sort of outside of the realm of possibility for even a small level of suspicion for most of these issues, I would not recommend writing this exhaustive of a differential diagnosis list, even though I think if you looked in a textbook, you could easily find this many differentials for dysuria being a problem that can occur with a lot of different things. However, in your plan, you would need to document follow-up to rule in or rule out every single one of these differential diagnoses, and that would lead to a lot of invasive and expensive testing for a pretty straightforward problem. So here's the plan based, it's put into 4 sections, including testing. So they did a urine dipstick in the office, which was already documented in the objective section. So this really doesn't need to be repeated in the plan, but then a culture was sent out, and there's a plan here for what to do when those pending results come back. Again, the course of therapy or treatment, in this case, the student chose Cipro, which is not really indicated for uncomplicated UTI without a fever or flank pain. And education and follow-up. And again, this is a straightforward follow-up. So if the symptoms resolve with the medication, then there's really no need to return for an office visit, but you do want to give the patient the warning signs of complications or pyelonephritis so they can follow up as needed. So next we have a few examples of SOAP notes, and I like these examples because of the speech bubbles where it gives you the rationale and why you're writing everything. And again, you'll see that there are different ways of documenting. For example, in this example, this student takes, her subjective is a complete HPI, and then she writes at the bottom just a one paragraph summary of the medical history and the medications. The objective is, again, a targeted exam which only addresses the current problem for the reason this patient is seeking care. And here's the assessment. In this case, the student has a list of differentials with a rationale for including each one, including one that is unlikely, and the rationale for why the likelihood of this differential is low. And then the plan is numbered in an easy to read and follow format. This case is a little bit more complicated. So this patient is presenting with a 10-day history of a cough, which definitely has a wider range of differentials that are associated with it. So this patient is questioned about her symptoms. Old carts is here as far as onset, remitting factors, etc. Medical history and a summary of the problem here. Then in the objective section, it's again a targeted exam. The assessment summarizes the patient's subjective and objective findings and gives a list of differential diagnoses, including their rationales in the order of most to least likely. And again, a step-by-step, easy to follow, numbered plan. And finally, we're about to run out of time, but we do have a more complicated patient here with fatigue, certainly not a straightforward case. So a lengthy history of the present illness, pertinent review of systems, and all of that is included here in the subjective, plus a patient's medical history and medications. The objective section includes a more extensive exam because there is definitely a broad range of differentials for the problem. And here the assessment and plan are more lengthy.